the pledge?
Go ahead. Ready, begin. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'll lead the moments of silence, asking for guidance and prayer and love and respect from the Lord and for us to Him, and from us to you and you to us. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, let's begin. Sir.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council. At this point, just in terms of a recap, there was the introduction on the status of the budget. Our finance director also has presented an overview of the budget, and each department has been before the council with their presentations on their individual department in terms of the narrative, their accomplishments, and their activities. And at this point, though, it's really it's part of the, I guess, part of the process for the council at this point to consider what's been presented, discuss issues, call up staff for additional input, consider any public comments, and then basically make a determination and direction to staff as to where you want to go at this point. I mean, obviously, there's the possibility you can approve the budget as presented. There's the possibility that you want to make revisions, minor or substantial, and you would direct staff to make cuts in certain areas or across the board, or you might just want further information. But at this time, it's something for the council, to discuss, ask questions of staff, provide direction as to what you'd like as far as the next step. Oh, there is one thing. Yes, there is. I forgot all about it. There is one thing. It came to our attention that apparently there has been some, I won't say confusion, I'm not sure what the right word is, but there has been some questioning as to why a proposed budget, why there is a proposed budget that starts out with an imbalance of $800,000. And I think to address that more completely and more fully for the council's and the public's information, Ty has put together a chart, and it follows actually the information that was presented in my PowerPoint as far as the numbers, but I didn't have a chart, and I suspect that maybe for clarity, a chart would be something that could address these more succinctly and or could clarify that matter. So, you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah. Gary will throw it up there for us. So we kind of looked at what changed, why are we in this $800,000 budget deficit. So put it into a chart and itemized it. You see the cash balance impact on the top there. So that 819 is where we end up with the budget. And then I just worked backwards. We talked about the self-insurance, how we had failed to put sufficient money in there to maintain our required levels. So in the short term, and we expect this to be a one-time type payment of $400,000 is coming from the general fund to help fund the self-insurance. So it's not going out to any vendor per se, but it's going into another fund reserve that's for our self-insurance fund, $400,000. So if you take that out, that leaves us with $419,000 deficit. Permits. The county, I guess, after listening to some of our conversations in council meeting, decided to start billing us for our permits. They were behind about 4 years. So we need to make sure we included enough to cover some of those permit costs. $200,000, one time only. That brings us to the $219,000.
I mean, they haven't billed us for permits for 4 years?
For 4 years, and they've been listening to our council meetings, and it was brought up once, and so the next week I started getting invoices.
Who brought that up?
I think it was
I won't
you,
throw
Jim.
anyone under the bus.
I think it was you, Jim, that brought that up.
Dang it.
So we anticipate a one-time $200,000. That brings us to the $219,000. So those are one-time payments. The rest are ongoing. So if you look at our deficit for ongoing operational type budget, we're about $200,000 upside down. One of those is the jail impact. That's a $200,000 hit to us to be able to fund and maintain without the jail being open. DOF, Department of Finance, ROPS denials, $250,000. The California Solar Initiative, this is the rebate we're getting for the solar field. That has finally come to an end. That's $120,000. Transit funding, as we discussed with the Kern COG audit, where we need to put $60,000 towards our fare box ratio. And then an offset is a refund of the property tax overpayment. That has ended. We're now receiving an additional $292,000. So if without any of these impacts and receiving the refund of the property tax, normally we'd be at a $118,000 fund balance at the end of next fiscal year.
The transit funding shortfall, that's coming out of the general funds, right?
Technically, it is, and it has to.
Okay, it has to.
Yes. And it's if you will, a ransom for the $1.3 million we received from the TDA, even though only about $500,000 of that ends up going to streets.
The self-insurance catch-up, is that something we're mandated to do, or this is just something
We're mandated to have a minimal amount in reserve, and I think it was 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there wasn't a contribution from the general fund, and that's why there's a doubling up or that additional $440,000 this year. And in fact, there was a bit of a depletion even without the accident there at Bowman at Downs. That was $120,000 that came out of that reserve too. So there have been, and there were other smaller amounts that were taken out of the company.
We're still working with our insurance to get refunds on anything that was over our deductible. We did get a payment a couple weeks ago for $300,000 that we put straight into there, but we're trying to maintain a minimum level of $1 million.
Right.
and we're about 400,000 away from that bill?
Right, with
Yes.
the 300,000 that we received.
Okay.
400 after the 300?
Yes. Currently, in here, it shows a balance of about 300,000, and but that was put together before we received that check.
Okay.
Is it possible to, I mean, I understand we need to catch up, but do we need to do it all in 1 year?
Well, it's just a matter of where you're placing the funds, because, I mean, unless something catastrophic happened, we're required to have a minimum amount in that fund. But the fund doesn't go away. It's just a separate fund that's off budget. In other words, we still have that money.
Yeah.
But it's going to be in this
It's going
fund.
from one bank account to the other.
Yes.
No, I understand that, yeah, okay. But once it goes in there, I don't know, I'm thinking about the budget shortfall, and,
May I?
yeah,
The state of California has certified us to be self-insured. That was our guarantee to them, that we would maintain a reserve in order to be self-insured and have their certificates. Without it, we run the risk of losing our certification, which would put us in a huge financial bind trying to find 100% insurance coverage.
I guess my mic wasn't on. There, that's better. So again, do we have to catch that up all in 1 year? Do we lose our certification if we don't catch it up this year?
It's possible.
Okay.
So far, the state has not done that, but they could at any time.
And I understand the wisdom in catching up the self-insurance fund. That's an important thing to do. It just seems more logical to me to do that in times of plenty, not, right now. So.
But it is a choice. It isn't a choice we have, is it?
I don't know.
I'm thinking
I'm trying
you're
to find out.
thinking it's a choice, and I don't
think it's a choice, is it?
Well, I think there is.
I
a-
don't believe it is. The state could pull the certificate, we'd never get it back, and we would be obligated then to provide 100% insurance coverage. We would lose our joint powers authority with CSAC.
See, we enjoy the ability to be in a pool at this time as far as insurance, and that could go away if we were audited and did not meet the requirements.
I do want to add as well that we did receive a check today for the sale of the property to the hospital. So that's $750,000 that we're putting into the general fund reserve account.
That'll be a separate fund.
So theoretically, you could say we have 1.2 million at the end of next fiscal year, but we keep that in a separate reserve account for emergency purposes.
Okay. A separate reserve account?
Yes.
So not the general fund.
It's still part of the general fund, but it's in a reserve account, and we'll come back with kind of the process we need to implement to access that fund if we need to.
Okay.
Only for emergencies though, right?
That's correct,
What-
because
what-
it's
what-
considered one-time money. A matter of fact, I know I've mentioned this to council before. When I'd gotten here, I'd always heard about the reserve. Well, until our finance director is establishing this particular fund with this money, correct? And he came to council to get your approval here about 3 months ago, or?
That was just for the sale of the property.
Oh, with the sale of the property. This will be the first time we've actually had a general fund reserve, which is a separate fund. Historically, when they talked about a reserve, they were always referring to the cash balance.
Just a positive cash
Yeah,
balance.
and so, to me, that's great to have a cash balance because we intend to have the same thing. But at the same time, we actually want to have one-time money placed in this fund, which is off budget.
Dennis, what would constitute an emergency that we would have to go into that 1.2 million? Do you know?
Well, something catastrophic that would be beyond our limits of coverage, as far as some sort of 4 or 5 person fatality in an intersection or something like that.
Yeah, any fatality could result in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that our coverage would not be able to support us on.
Okay. All right. And one other quick question. You said it was in reference to the sale of the property to the hospital. Will we benefit from that outside of the sale of the property? Will we get taxes from that?
There's certainly
Would get property tax. Otherwise, there's services, so I'm not sure of any sales tax benefit.
See, we do get property tax
We would get property tax because it's not a,
from it's a nonprofit, is it not?
no,
The hospital?
yeah, I thought it was private, but
The hospital was converted to a private agency.
So
we
the
would-
hospital does pay, I'm sorry.
No, we were
The
asking the
hospital
same thing.
does pay property tax?
Yeah, I don't believe they're a 501c3.
right.
I don't think they do. I didn't say that out loud.
It still picks it up.
I'm sorry, folks.
It is also possible when they're actually constructing a facility there that they register the project and we'd get sales tax for the materials purchased on that.
Just like everybody else, sir.
Correct.
Okay. So the city benefits 2 ways: the sale of the property and the taxes.
If they are in fact private as we believe they are.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I like the idea of having a separate fund for the reserve. I guess I was kind of under the assumption all along that that's what we were doing. So I'm glad we're doing it.
Well, I was until 3 years ago, and when I said, what's the amount in the reserve fund?
Right.
And they said, they would give me the same number as cash balance. I said, no, the reserve fund. They said, there is no reserve fund, and there has never been a reserve fund. It's always been the cash balance.
We've had it as fund designations, which aren't very restrictive. I mean, you can change them at will.
Yeah.
But this, we're setting up a separate bank account as well to keep it from being commingled.
Okay.
Just, I don't have you guys' background. So when you say fund balance, this is the first year we've had fund balance?
No, this is the first year we'd have a separate fund
Separate fund
for
reserves.
Right.
So in prior way of operating, we operated how?
When they talked about reserves, they were talking about the cash balance that existed in accounts that was above the budgeted levels.
So would that also cause us not to operate with a balanced budget then?
No, we'd have a balanced budget. It was that it wasn't restricted in its use and set aside just for what typically a fund reserve is set aside for, emergency type
Okay.
transactions.
Okay.
Emergency meaning we run out of cash and we need to.
That is one, as well as Ms. Ford said, liability type claims. And
Oh, I thought that
judgments.
was the self-insurance fund you were talking about. Could be both. Okay.
The reserve being set for the self-insurance would not cover, for example, a fatality
Right.
that we got sued for. And our excess insurance coverage has limitations. And if we lost a fairly large multi-million-dollar lawsuit, we may have to dip into reserves to cover the excess.
Okay. So this year, I mean, say for a moment we don't modify the budget, and I'm not thinking that, but we will still end up with a positive cash balance in addition to the reserve. Are we planning on putting what we don't budget in terms of cash balance, positive cash balance into the reserve? Or
That would probably be something the council could decide about this time next year. In other words, rather than
At the
put it
end of
in
the
during
year.
this year, it could still be part of our operational, available money. But if it seems to be, in a sizable neighborhood, that'd be a decision the council can make.
Yeah,
going into
we've
next
got to
year.
look at, as well, we want to keep a cash balance in there for cash flow purposes as well.
Right,
With the
okay.
different timing of revenue and expenditures.
So we wouldn't use that money to pay down anything that was an outstanding debt or that cost us a lot of interest?
We wouldn't have to, that's at council's discretion.
Okay.
I
So
have to say that I'm very, I feel a whole lot better about this because quite frankly, I was taking your name in vain in my head, going, how could they?
Mine or his?
Both of theirs, actually.
We get that a lot.
Because I kept saying, how did they not know until Tuesday, before our meeting on Wednesday, that we were $800 and some odd thousand short in our budget? If you explained that to me beforehand, I obviously went straight over my head, because I'm frustrated here going, okay, police department is 70% of our budget, 70% of 800,000. This is how much we're going to cut from police. This is how much we're going to cut. This is how much we're going to cut. So are you telling me all that reasoning I did not need to go through, and we don't have a shortfall on our budget, and we have $118,566 in excess of what we are going to spend?
No, we're still, as it currently sits, is the 800,000 expenditures over revenue. We were explaining where those numbers come from. Some that are one-time only and others that are reoccurring, but just to give,
I got that.
yeah.
So, explain it. I operate on a budget every single day in my business, and I've never seen anything as difficult to understand as this. I can't wait to get this new program up so I can actually look at it and say, maybe I understand it. Because quite frankly, if we are balancing our budget with a one-time $32,000 for revenue, for reserves, and we are taking a one-time extra $200,000 out for self-insurance, so we have really $400,000. Is that correct?
Right. The 400,000 and the, where's that other one that's 200?
The permits.
Permit, one time.
Permits.
I thought there was one other one that's one time. It's ongoing. But anyways, it is about three-quarters of this $800,000 is one time.
So I think we're going to end up with kind of a communication issue here, where we
Yeah.
have the last budget hearing, we have it, the community's understanding we have an $800,000 deficit.
That's,
And then at the end of this meeting, are we telling everyone we only have a $100,000 deficit, or?
if you're taking a look at the one-time costs, we do have, it's 600,000, right?
Yeah, the one-time cost.
400 and 200.
Yeah, one cost is $600,000. The remainder is, would be an ongoing cost. But for the budget purposes, expenditures over revenues is $800,000. And then this is, the chart's intended to show you where that $800,000 is, or what that is comprised of.
Even without the sale of the land that we,
We're not taking that into account, that's extra money.
So that's not in this number then.
okay. I guess in terms of revenue over expenditures, I would consider that a revenue, wouldn't it? Be a land sale?
Oh, yes, but that's that's off budget. I mean, when we develop budgets, it's usually, you know, our revenue, our annual revenue versus our annual proposed expenditures. And that's why we, indicated in the initial presentation that, and particularly with our budget situation, and also because of the potential need to bond here in about 3 years ago, or go out for bonds, is we need to create that reserve 15 to 30%. And so that's why the suggestion is, I mean, though you could call it a revenue, that's something that's intended that anytime we have one-time revenue, we hope to put that in a reserve.
Well, I'm just thinking in my mind, if we're saying it's okay that we have an $800,000 deficit because we had a one-time $700,000, quote unquote revenue, that needs to be reflected in the budget. Otherwise, we need to just focus on taking care of an $800,000 deficit. I mean, we need to. I don't know.
Are you saying like next year?
No, I mean this year.
Oh,
Yeah. I mean, either we have an $800,000 deficit or we have a $100,000 deficit. How are we counting it? Because I consider an $800,000 deficit very serious, and I consider a $1,000 deficit also serious, just not nearly as serious. So I don't know. What problem are we tackling? I guess.
Well, I guess the thing is you're being asked to reduce the 1.3, when we close the year out, will be a $1.3 million as far as our cash balance. And you're being asked with our proposal to take $800,000 to $1.3 million, which means when we conclude next year, we'll be at a $500,000 cash balance. We'll still have the $750,000 in the regular reserve, and you will have made up the difference between the expenditures over revenues.
And then the following year, that $600,000 wouldn't be there,
Right.
but there'd still be the $200,000.
Yeah.
That we need to address one way or another.
Right.
Is there a reason to have the 732,000 or 52, whatever it was, in reserves if we already have met the 1 million?
Well, that's a different fund. In other words, the 1 million is required for the self-insurance fund.
Self-insurance,
And it's kind of a position that the past several councils, particularly since the elimination of the RDA, has taken, that if we get one-time money, let's put that aside so that we actually have a reserve.
I understand the need for the reserve, but it's almost illusionary because it's not going to come back again. We'll never have that back, the 700,000. And so consequently, what we're using it to do is shore up the reserves that aren't our reserves for self-insurance, but our own cash reserves. Am I correct?
Well, the 752 is standalone. It doesn't have anything to do with the reserve that's in the self-insurance fund.
I got that.
Okay. And so it's just so that, for instance, when you got the bond, the issuers, they will actually take a look at your financial situation and status. And they like to see a minimum of 15, preferably 30% of your operating expense in a reserve that's off budget, that's available. And then you'll get a higher rating and lower interest rates on your bond. And a matter of fact, if you're well below 15%, it'll be hard to find a company that'll bond you. That'll actually issue the bonds.
So I think I understand a little bit better now. So we're using the one-time revenue as, and I don't know what else to call it other than revenue, but we're using that to establish a reserve. We don't have any other money in the reserve besides that, correct?
Not a real reserve, no.
Not a real reserve, the actual account. The problem that I'm having here now is if we're, it sounds like we're actually doing okay on this year's budget with all things considered, but the fact of the matter is we still have a serious communication problem. The fact that anybody who's not listening to this discussion right now is thinking we have a serious problem on our hands. And unless we call that a revenue, and I'm not saying we're bending, we're messing with terminology here, but we need to let people know we don't have a serious problem if we don't actually have a serious problem. And the way to do that is to call that a revenue and to show that our cash or that our deficit is not $800,000 this year.
I think that part of the communication is because of accounting procedures. And
Yeah.
the thing is the carryover balance, when we look at the budget, we're looking at the budget from, the first thing we try and do is, first thing we do is we ask for the departments to tell us what they believe they're going to need to spend. That gives us a picture of the expenditures. Then we take a look at the revenues, because the way you would want to approach it is you would want your revenues to be greater, or at least equal or greater.
Yeah.
Well, when we projected our revenues based on the requests of the departments, revenues weren't there. So we asked them twice to make cuts. So they've already cut $1 million off the original request, and we're to the point that we're still left with this $800,000 issue. So it's not, we can't get any more or can't project any more revenue than what we actually expect we're going to receive. So what we know we have is right now, we're going into this year, or concluding this year, we're going to have a $1.3 million cash balance. And so what we're going to do is, that's off budget though. So what Ty's going to do is transfer that.
Off budget because we haven't started the new fiscal year. Does it start July 1st?
because
It starts July 1st.
And that's what.
Okay.
Yes.
And it's, it's
I-
like putting it in a savings account.
I see what you're doing now. I totally missed that point. I'm sorry. For some reason, I was thinking June 1st was a fiscal year. Between the calendar years, the federal fiscal year and the city fiscal year, I get lost real easy. So, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead. So we basically, we can't count it as reserve for this. We're just going to report that we have a larger positive
We're going to have
cash balance than we would have previously.
Correct.
We're having to take out the cash balance to be able to allow for the $800,000 of expenditures over revenues.
Yeah.
But
But-
instead of starting with 1.3, it would be starting with 2 million in the cash balance, with 750 of that in the reserve
Yeah.
account.
And then additionally, it's the idea that from a overall standpoint, we're really looking at sustaining what would appear to be a $200,000 deficit as opposed to 800. In other words, we're not going to have this every year. This is a 600,000 of that is one time.
And which, I guess we should also explain, we're also looking at the fire contract to see if there's a way to reduce that. This is the last year of that contract, so it's up for negotiation.
And then the city attorney will be explaining something to the council tomorrow that might save us an additional $200,000. This will be in closed session.
Is that because of the fire?
No.
Or what is the anticipation of
Well,
saving from the fire? Do we have an idea?
It's something that is a pending litigation. and
Oh, okay.
The attorney could explain that.
If we take the funds that we called them rollover to begin this year with, monies that weren't spent but that were allocated
That's what-
last year, and then we add the 752,000, does that give us a false reading of profitability, or that's not a good word in the city government, of excess funds?
It's not a false reading, but what we're trying to do is not make that available for, just to reach in and say, hey, we're doing fine because we received this.
You don't want us to spend it. Yeah, I get you. I don't want us to spend it
It's the
either.
one-time revenues should only be used for one-time expenditures type argument, and you should always have a fallback.
Well, and it's kind of the idea that a budget is an income statement, and you want to try and actually balance that, where possible. This isn't one of those years, but based on what you're bringing in. Whereas you're looking more at instead of the income statement, you're looking at your balance sheet because you're just changing assets. In other words, the 750,000 was a piece of property, and it sold, and now it really should be looked at in terms of the balance sheet as opposed to an income statement.
So again, if we're reporting if the paper's going to report, they would report that it's 118
Deficit.
deficit that we need to make some adjustments on, not the 800.
Well, over time, that's true, but the point is, so I'll say this one more time, I guess. The point is we have expenditures as proposed over revenues of $800,000. And the proposal is we're going to reach into the cash balance, or for the council to direct us to reach into the cash balance to square up the budget so it's balanced. And that's what it's going to do is reduce our 1.3 cash balance that we're going to close this current year with, reduce it to $500,000. But what we're trying to point out is that the bulk of this $800,000, use the word deficit, is not going to be continuing in the future, only around $200,000 of that. And after tomorrow night, that might not quite be the case. It might be balanced.
So I'm just trying to. So I came into this meeting thinking we're going to have to make serious cuts. Now I'm thinking we probably won't have to make maybe any cuts. However, I don't know how to. Again, maybe this is just me thinking like a politician here, but I ran on my biggest issue was fiscal responsibility, and if I pass a budget that has an $800,000 deficit, like how do I respond to my constituents and tell this whole story that's taking us, a good 30 minutes so far to understand?
Well, I think one way you might do it, it's not going to help Ty because he has to follow accounting procedures. What would help you and constituents is when I started here, when I started as city manager, we had an $84,000 cash balance.
Yeah.
That's all we had. And now we've got it up to 1.3 million. Now we have this situation, we're going to have to bring it down. But to explain it to your constituents is, and it doesn't help tie up from an accounting standpoint, but we have savings now from our revenues over our expenditures over the last 3 years, so that we've saved from $84,000 to $1.3 million. Now we're having an extraordinary year. It's kind of like, let me put it this way. I ordinarily couldn't buy a panel flat for whatever the size, 48, 56 inch color TV on my annual budget, okay? But I've been saving. I've been saving for 3 years. I look at my annual, what I'm going to make and what my expenses are. I still can't buy that TV, but I saved from my prior 3 years' revenues, and I've got more than enough to buy that flat screen TV. So I decided I'm going to buy it,
Right.
even though my revenues say I can't afford it.
So, what do you guys think we should do?
I hear your concerns, because that's one of the things. I'm not an accounting background, and therefore you have to talk really lame terms to me so that I can grab it, because someone's going to ask me out in town, and I need to be able to tell them, here's where we're at, and this is what they've done, and we approved it, just like Jim is saying. So, I mean,
Could we maybe establish like a fact sheet? Nothing rose colored at all. I mean, I want that $800,000 number on there, but just a fact sheet showing this is what our current balance on the budget is. This is what our cash balance is going to be. Or this is what it is. This is what it's going to be, and then this is what our reserve is and what it's going to be. That would,
Okay, I believe that's on the front page of your
do we have that?
budget, isn't it? Ty? He said all but the 750, which is really
Yeah.
wouldn't be part of the budget anyhow.
I know we promised that we would have the public be able to ask their questions. Is this an appropriate time to have them ask their questions? That way we can learn from their questions too. I saw some questions that Stan had sent, and I'd like to be able to see if we can address some of those. Do you two have any problem if we do
Absolutely
that
not.
at this time?
No, but in answer to your question, on page 21 of your budget document,
Of the budget document?
yeah, that does the walkthrough.
This one?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So this is going to have what I asked for minus the actual reserve account, the
Right.
way it is now.
Right up there on the top line, beginning balance in 16-17, it has the 1.3 million.
Oh, 12. Dyslexic. All right. There we go.
Start the proposed budget up here as well. Fall down our revenues and expenditures.
Right here.
Okay.
Include you down
For this, and then you
here. 500,000.
Okay. So the only difference between this and a revised one would be that our cash balance would start off, beginning balance would be different.
Correct, it'd be, what, closer to 2.1 million.
Okay.
But you're including the
And you're including
750.
that in there.
No, we don't want to.
Don't want that.
What's that?
We don't want to include the 750.
Well, as a beginning
Yeah,
cash
no,
balance.
that's true, yes,
Yeah.
that's true.
I put it as reserve.
Believe me, I have no intention of spending that. I want to maintain a large reserve as much as I can, so. One more thing real quick. And I missed last meeting, so I apologize if I'm bringing up something that you already talked about. And I did try to watch it, but my internet wasn't cooperating. We had talked a couple months ago about presenting kind of an ideal budget, in a perfect world if we had enough revenue. Did we already do that, or is that forthcoming?
Yes, no, we've already prepared that.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to,
He's going to, there you go, optimal budget.
okay. Then I'll wait for that discussion. when it comes. Oh, we already discussed it?
Right.
Okay.
With the opening presentation.
Okay.
If you have other questions, certainly you can.
We could do
Ask,
public
yeah.
comment now if you
Yeah.
want, and then I'll
Yeah.
Sure, Colin.
read and think about this.
Okay, is there public comment?
Stan Rotora. Could that last number that's on there says refund of property tax overpayment ongoing. My understanding is we had like 3 years we had to pay back something.
Well, it was withheld,
Withheld.
is what happened.
Pardon?
It was withheld. In other words, they just didn't give it to us.
Oh, okay. So now we've got $292,000 that's actually coming to us rather than being withheld is all. It's not like there's more money or anything. They just withheld it 3 years.
That's
Correct.
Okay, so that was really opposite of a one-time income, and now we are getting it as opposed to them withholding it.
Correct.
Okay. Just a couple comments on this whole philosophical thing we're talking about here. My understanding is that our fund balance, as opposed to the cash balance, is like minus $1 million. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it's negative. I don't remember the exact amount.
Okay. And after this year, if we lose $330,000, that is this fiscal year as opposed to next fiscal year, our fund balance will be like a minus $1.3 million.
Where are you picking the 300,000 out, Stan?
Well, this year we're overspent by something like 300,000 based upon the third quarter
I got you.
estimated year-end balance expenditures over income. There was like 330,000, something like that. So at the end of this year, our fund balance is going to be a minus 1.3 million. Then if we take out, and we have another $800,000 overspent this year, our fund balance becomes a minus $2.1 million, roughly. Now, it seems to me that what the auditor was concerned about when that one time when he was here 2 years ago and said that we had whatever the terminology he used, I don't remember. His concern was the fund balance impacting our ability to borrow, not our cash balance, because it's the fund balance is really the difference between our cash, our assets, and our liabilities, and that was what he was concerned about. All right? So you can have lots and lots of cash, but that doesn't mean your real economic status, if you will, probably not the right word, is good. My concern is that we're only talking about the cash balance, and we're not talking about the fund balance. Our fund balance, the reason the auditor was concerned was that we took on that loan from the wastewater plant, and our fund balance went to minus $4 million. And now we've spent 3 years getting it back up to a minus $1 million. But that is, I thought what the auditor was saying is your reserve is really what you have over zero. That is, our reserve right now is a minus 1 million. We would actually have to have a positive 1 million to have a $1 million reserve. And that was what they looked at in terms of trying to get a loan. If you throw in $750,000 now into the general fund, we still have, obviously a minus 1 million and a plus $750,000. We're still a net fund balance as opposed to cash balance that's negative. You know, we're not out of the woods. And so I guess I would tend to caution people thinking that spending $800,000 more than we bring in is not a serious problem. The question in my mind is going to be, what does that do next year? That is, some of that is only a loss this year, perhaps, but that part of it that is also going to be a loss next year continues to drag our fund balance down. It would obviously also drag the cash value balance down. So I think we need to, before we decide that spending $800,000 more than we have is not important, I think what we need to do is look at how this year impacts next year and the following year, and look at it from a bigger, broader perspective. Because we've worked really hard to get that negative fund balance from a minus 4 million to a minus 1 million, and now we're saying, we'll just take it back down to a minus 2.1. I may be missing something there, but I was thinking that was what the auditor's concern was.
What you're missing, though, I think, is you're again comparing long-term liability against the ongoing annual operating budget. Because if I were to buy a house and you look at my revenues, and I buy a house you look at my salary, and I'm buying me a $350,000 house, I can't say, well, I just don't make enough money. Instead, it's structured so I'm paying X amount a month, X amount a year, and I'm making the payments. But if you look on from a long-term liability standpoint, I may be underwater, but from a cash flow perspective, which is what a budget is, on an annual basis, I'm making those payments fine. Because the debt I know you're referring to is that wastewater debt. We have that structured so that's paid back at $120,000 a year.
And that was not a loan. That was a settlement and a
loss.
It was a settlement
they took on.
No, it was a settlement and a lawsuit
I
ordered
understand
a
that,
structured
but
repayment.
From the budget standpoint, it was taken on, again, from an accounting standpoint, it was an advance
I know that, yeah.
from, which was a minus $4 million.
But
okay?
this is one of those scenarios where pure accounting principles isn't telling you the accurate picture.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, and I've been in conversations with rating, S&P and Moody's and Fitch and all those,
Yeah.
and other organizations where we were issuing bonds, and they're looking at ability to repay. They're not
Okay.
going to look blindly at a fund balance. They'll
Okay.
look at it and they'll ask you questions, and you explain
Okay.
it
Well-
just as we have explained it, and it's
our
ability
audit-
to pay.
our auditor, pun and greedy or whatever, was concerned about negative fund balance. So, and I quite frankly question why it was taken on as an advance as opposed to a long-term debt. I'm sure there was a reason that I don't understand. But as long as it is there, then I think we do need to be concerned. And not only from that standpoint, but next year, are you telling us that there's not going to be a negative impact next year?
Well, there's two things. I think that what you're looking at is you would look at next year, if you're just looking at these numbers, you'd say that there's going to be a $200,000 ongoing expense that's continuing, including next year. But I think after tomorrow night, that might even be eliminated. And then there is also the renewal of a Measure L that's going to be proposed, and we have a presentation that will go before the council on that. And based on the way that's, well, not even to mention the fire, that'll be a bonus. And either one of those scenarios would actually cause the what would appear to be here to be an ongoing $200,000 deficit next year. That would cause that to go away. Either of two things, not even including the fire.
Stan, can I add a question onto yours then? Okay, I'm
I
trying
guess.
to understand here. We are going to base our budget decision on a couple of maybes and one maybe probability for next year. We are going to look at the money, the carryover, the funded monies that were not spent last year to cover, to make us, to better us this year.
That's correct.
Okay, so we took those cuts already, and if we hadn't taken those cuts, where would we be?
I think you would have had you wouldn't have your entire $1.3 million carryover balance.
Okay, tell me then the advantage of, not to our ability to get loans, or our ability to buy sell bonds or any of that thing. What is the advantage of that to the people of this community?
Oh, what? I mean, didn't understand the question.
The question is, I'm going to use Jim's, although I think that most people only care what the end result is rather than how you got there. I want to be able to say, we took those cuts twice this year so far. The fund balances that we didn't, the monies that we didn't spend that were allocated to be spent, we took those and we said to the people, to our staff and all of our people, you are going to spend less. We are going to hold it here in our hands so we can put it forward for next year. Am I assuming that's?
That's probably that statement is accurate.
Okay.
Partly because we received our letter, from the Department of Finance in either January or December, so we knew that they were going to their determination was it's going to be $250,000 to $300,000 in their favor, not in our favor
Okay.
on the budget.
All right, so if we did that, why did we have to make those cuts? Only to make it look better this year?
It wasn't to make it look better this year. It was to make sure that we would still be able to sustain an adequate reserve for next year. In other words, we will
But we already
conclude.
had the 1.3, didn't we?
Yes, but by taking the 800, you'd be down to 500,000. Had we not asked the department heads to take a very close look at what their year-to-date expenditures, what were actually needed, and reserve that, then we would be deep. It would be very doubtful we would be able to be looking at a $500,000 cash balance to conclude next year's budget.
Well,
Stan, I'm sorry I interrupted. I was trying to take it further.
That's good information. We've been actually in a position in previous years where we had to borrow money from the wastewater
To
fund
do
just
that.
for operating funds. And it looks like, we kind of got out of that, and we had enough money so we didn't have to borrow money from the wastewater fund to operate. Now we're going back and putting ourselves in a position where we're going to have to borrow money from somewhere. And I think the wastewater fund is the only place there is any money just to operate the first part of the fiscal year.
Why would we do that? We don't have to do that at all. We have a $1.3 million cash balance. Actually, it's $2.1 million
I'm sorry,
cash balance.
This year, yes. And so it'll be the following year where we might have a problem.
We'll still have a
Stuart.
cash balance and a reserve
Yes,
next year.
that's right.
And
I guess I'm
and-
not sure how much of an operating, what our operating budget really requires in terms of a operating reserve to pay salaries early
good
on.
question.
It's right here on
Because at
page-
one point in time, we were borrowing $3 million, it seemed to me, from the
We-
wastewater fund that we would repay
Yeah,
before
we,
the end
we
of the year.
initiated that loan in case we needed it and never did.
Oh,
So
okay.
it was never,
Okay.
the transaction
Well,
never occurred.
let-
The other positive is, sorry, Stan, just real quick. The other positive is triple flip has ended with sales tax. So instead of getting 3/4 of that sales tax with our property tax, which is twice a year, we now get that on a monthly basis, which helps out our
Cash
cash flow greatly.
Okay. One of the things that was just mentioned, I believe it was by Mr. Spear, is that we've got a 30-year loan on the wastewater fund for like 0.5%, and we're only paying like $120,000. As soon as the wastewater fund goes out in bonds at 2 1/4 or whatever that number is, that our engineer or our consultant gave us a number. It was well above 0.5%. I think it was like 2 1/4 or 2.3, something like that. We're going to have to raise the interest on that loan. Otherwise, the wastewater fund will be subsidizing the general fund, which isn't legal, I don't believe. So I think there is going to be additional monies that the general fund is going to have to pay. If you
Are you
can't
s-
repay the whole loan,
Okay, Stan, you're killing me. It's not a loan. It's not.
well, it doesn't matter, but it's
It
money
does
that
matter.
is owed. I don't care what you call it, Jim.
But it's owed at a structured amount ordered by the court.
I don't
So
know that it was ordered by the court.
it was due to a
No,
lawsuit
wait,
settlement.
Why don't we let Dennis answer? What actually happened?
No, Councilman Sanders is correct. That was as a result of a settlement agreement with where there was anticipated litigation.
Yeah, well, it was originally
And it was
done
a repayment
to avoid
schedule.
the court.
A repayment schedule that was acceptable was established.
well-
And I believe it was 30 years.
Yeah,
I think
so it was,
$120,000 a
but,
year.
and as long as the wastewater fund didn't need it, then that's fine. But the wastewater fund shouldn't be paying 2.3% interest on money that it borrows just so it can allow the city to pay back money at 0.5%.
You're telling a story that's not true. The wastewater fund was not borrowed from. It was not borrowed. The amount it was at one time, but what you're talking about, the quote unquote loan, was not something that was borrowed from the wastewater fund. That was considered at the time a legitimate expense from the wastewater fund.
Franchise fee was
Yeah, it was in.
You know, I've heard a lot of stories
I'm
about
trying
that.
to remember the actual term that was used.
I-
But it was
an
considered an
in lieu
actual
franchise fee that was deemed not to be permissible.
by the court. But at the time, it was considered by the city as a legitimate expense of the wastewater fund, and so it was never intended to be repaid because it was an actual expense.
Well, you know,
So
when it
it
was
was-
announced here in this room, I believe what we were told is that it was always intended to be a loan. They just forgot to do the paperwork, and they were now going back and filing it. But let's not go into that now. I think we've got other things that probably need to be discussed. But my feeling is I don't want to see the bottom line is I don't want to see the wastewater fund getting 0.5% money on monies that we have to pay 2.3% on. And that's the bottom line. Okay, you don't have to agree with that. Getting back to what I had sent in earlier, and I think most of you have copies of what I sent in. The first item was I went back and did a comparison of what's in our budget numbers here and what's in the CAFR on 4 different funds. 2 of the funds basically are identical down to $1 or $2, and that would be the general fund and the gas tax fund. And then I also compared 2 other funds, which were funds 3 and 5, which are the transit fund and the wastewater fund, and they're not similar. I mean, they're off by, I wouldn't say they are similar, they're off by several $100,000 in places, and I think Ty agrees that the one had a mistake in it, the wastewater fund, where it's off by $1 million in one place and $2 million in another.
Oh, it was just adding in the transfers, that the
Yes.
sign was swapped, correct?
Right. But in any event, my feeling is it bothers me when I see a major difference between what's in the CAFR and what's in the budget numbers. And I think eventually, if not during this budget period, as soon as possible, we need to figure out if 2 of the funds can be essentially identical, why are 2 of them, way off? And I think we need to resolve those issues.
We're looking at, once again, balance sheet versus income statement. And, a balance sheet will have your capitalization, your accruals, your depreciation, has a whole bunch of other items.
They're both using accruals.
Your CAFR is including your long-term liabilities. It's very much like a balance sheet as opposed to the budget, which is your income statement.
I'm sorry, I was looking at the cash balance sheet of the CAFR. The CAFR's got like 3 or 4 different balance sheets, and one of those balance sheets is a cash balance sheet that is based on the accrual methodology. So I think they probably ought to be a lot closer than they are. Going on to point 2, the transfers in and out. You gave us a little bit of information on transfers, but we still do not have a clear purpose for all of the transfers. Some of the transfers, yes, but not all of them. We don't have any idea how those transfers were calculated, and I think in order to understand what those transfers are, we need to know how those transfers were calculated. And then we also need to know how that money that's being transferred is being spent. And frankly, out of all the funds, my primary concern are the general fund and the self-insurance fund. Those 2 look like the external funds are generating an awful lot of transfer dollars. As a matter of fact, if you look at the administrative transfer costs generated by the 3 external funds, 2, 3, and 5, they come up to a lot of money. As a matter of fact, it looks like they cover most of, if not all, of the administrative costs of the general fund. And the general fund should be generating administrative costs as well. And I don't see why the external funds are generating that much administrative funds. At one point in time, we had an administrative ISF where everybody contributed administrative funds, even the general fund, into the administrative fund ISF, and you could tell exactly what administrative costs were being paid. And you can't do that the way the budget is anymore, but that doesn't mean that we can't at least have numbers that say where those numbers, or pardon me, where the numbers came from in terms of calculating the transfers, and then where those dollars are being spent and what they're spent on. So I would like to see those numbers, the calculation of the transfers, and then how the money is spent. And then item 3 is the allocation of staff salaries. There are 4 or 5 of the lead general fund people, directors and city manager, that are getting funded out of the three funds, 2, 3, and 5. And as a matter of fact, not to pick on Mr. Spear, but since he's probably the lead person here, 35% of his salary is coming from the wastewater fund, and 25% is coming from the transit fund. And my feeling is that his priorities, if this is actually looking at his priorities, where he's spending his time, then we got a serious problem regarding who's doing what work. The biggest problem our city has is budget. New tax base, new revenue, and new jobs. And that is where the focus for the whole city and the city staff ought to be. And the leadership of that effort should be Mr. Spear. And I don't see where anything the sewer fund is doing would require 35% of its time, nor do I see anything the transit group is doing would require 25% of its time. And I would like to see all of the director and above salaries move back into the general fund. Those are administrative staff positions, and they should be paid for by administrative overhead. And I don't see any need for the external funds paying both administrative overhead for administrative services, and then also pay major portions of administrative personnel salary as a direct cost. As a matter of fact, I'm assuming when those directors and above are in those, that is, their salaries are coming out of those funds, they're also paying administrative overhead on top of the administrators' salaries. But since we don't know how the overhead or transfer administrative salaries are being calculated, we don't know. So that's why it's important to figure out where did those numbers come from that are for the transfers. And then I think what we need to do is to make sure that all of our administrators are actually funded by the general fund. 2 separate items.
Can we get them to, because that was one of the things I was looking at too. Can you gentlemen address that, please?
Well, I believe Ty already prepared a chart that's been shared
The
before
chart you
about
had, yeah.
Yeah, I did the transfers, but I also put this up on the screen. Which
in
one?
terms of allocations.
Yeah, the allocations was passed out earlier.
Yeah, that was-
But he was talking about the administrative work and the administrative services.
Sure. Overhead is typically for functions that serve the overall city, that you can't really pick out pieces that go to specific activities. We have allocated our salaries such because there is a direct cost. We do direct work for some of these different funds. For wastewater, for example, we're getting ready to put together the financial plan that requires a lot of work from my finance staff, myself and my assistant, to go through and that's getting ready to bond, that's putting together official statements, that's doing the cost studies. Same with transit. There's a lot of work that goes on that's specific just to transit It's the allocation for county costs and other internal, the claims, the TDA claims. Those are items that we can specifically attribute to specific activities, and so we charge it thus as is.
How do you figure out those numbers?
It's based on a time allocation.
Well, I understand, but then what is the allocation based on?
Which allocation?
The-
The time allocation, that's based on.
The numbers, yeah. Let's go. I can see putting one of the staff members that work for you, who is doing work, and it's directly applied to a particular fund under that fund. But you are paid for on administrative overhead, and you're doing work for all of them. You're doing work for everybody. You're doing work. You put this budget together, right?
Right. And that, I don't have enough staff where I can assign out every task to a staff member. There's certain items I have to do by myself, and that's okay because we're a small group and that's how we work. But I don't always have a staff member I can assign to do all the projects so I don't have to work on them. That just doesn't happen.
Okay. Well, let's go to the example of Mr. Spear. 35% on the wastewater, 25% on transit. My feeling is, you know, if he spends 5% of his time on the wastewater plant, that probably is as much time as he's got. Right now.
Well, Stan, what you need to know is I work between 12 and 13-hour days. I work usually 2 days over the weekend. On meeting days, I work 17, 18-hour days. So if you want to run my salary on a per-hour basis, I probably am at least as low as mid-management. And if you also want to know, my contract's very specific. I am to be the Public Works Director as well as the position I occupy right now. And as part of that, if you look in the municipal code, you'll find out there's 6 divisions that comprise the Public Works Division. One of them is wastewater.
Yeah,
And further, as far as the department heads, mid-managers, and the city manager, they went to an exempt time card years ago. They no longer identify every quarter-hour segment in a day. Instead, they only indicate the time that are exempt areas. They don't count on a time-for-time basis. Matter of fact, yesterday, the bulk of my time was spent in wastewater because I met with our consultants on some meetings that they have to prepare for the city council. But on a day-to-day basis, I can't tell you. Sometimes I spend more time one, sometimes the other. But any of these counts are legitimate time allocations for me.
Okay, I guess I would totally agree you're overworked, and I think you should be 2 people. I have no doubt about that in my mind. However,
well, there's no doubt that those allocations can be correct on any given day. But for every day, I can't tell you how much I spend.
Oh no, and I
get here at
wouldn't ask you
6:15 in the morning and
But
leave
if
at
I
6
could
at night
actually
unless there's a
say
meeting.
something. Right now, according to the budget, you're getting paid 25% of your time out of the general fund. And I agree, you're doing a lot of work in a lot of areas. But it's hard for me to believe that only 25% of your time is being spent on general fund work. All right?
What's your point, Stan? I'm trying to understand where you're going with this.
Right now, the funds, external funds, 2, 3, and 5 are paying for 75% of our city manager's salary.
Okay. So what's your point? Where are you going with this?
My point is he's a city manager.
Yes.
All right? He's in charge of and responsible for the whole city, including the general fund.
Including all the other funds, too.
Well, yes. But I fail to see how he can run the majority of the city, which is really based upon the general fund, on 25% of his time. All right? I think we need to revisit the allocation, because to me it looks like we're transferring the salaries of all of the director and above personnel away from the general fund and into the external funds. All right? Those should be, those administrative positions should be general fund positions. That's what I'm saying. Okay. Going on to, item 4. We kind of covered this. My feeling is that the budget deficits that we're looking at now aren't sustainable. I can understand that there may be one or two of these larger costs that we're not going to have next year, but I think before we start really saying they're not important, we should go through on at least an out year, 2-3 years, and see how much of this really is sustainable, because I don't see it based upon the numbers that I've seen. Item 5. Now this is actually gets, and we haven't talked about this yet. So one of the resolution that adopts this budget says the Director of Finance and Treasurer is authorized to conduct the year-end transfers. And my feeling is that particular part of the resolution should read, the Director of Finance is directed to work with a Finance Committee to generate a year-end budget adjustment proposal to be presented to the City Council before, I put September 31st. It could be any time. But the year-end reconciliation of the budget is a budget issue, and it should be voted on by the council. I don't think you want to just hand over the control of the budget to the finance director. We've been talking about the council taking a more active role in controlling the budget, and I think the best way to do that is to actually have the finance director work with the finance committee and propose something to the whole council. Because otherwise you don't really know until the CAFR comes out in February what happened.
This isn't to increase the budget by any sort of means. This is to be able to do our accruals, do our depreciation, do our capitalization. If there are budget adjustments, it's within the authority of that council has given us, as in I need to move $50 from my printing and production into my office supplies to cover the budget there. This is not to increase the budget. This is to close out the year so that we can turn all this information over to the auditors in a timely manner so that we can meet our deadline with the state controller on our comprehensive annual finance report.
I don't see there being an issue there working with the finance committee.
It's time.
Yeah, I understand. But that's what the finance committee is for, is to work the reconciliation of the year-end budget.
Time, would it be difficult to do that? Would it be, what time does it cost? I guess I'm asking, and the ability to, because we've wanted the finance committee to be more involved, to understand where it's going, and when they come back, and I'm wondering, does it inhibit your ability to get your work done, to talk to the finance committee and share with them what you're doing?
I don't mind talking and sharing with them what we're doing, but this is a 3-month process that we're working on every day of the week to get finished up, to tidy up, to do the transactions we have to do.
I don't think you need to give it to them.
If we have to wait for approval to do these transactions, then really does inhibit us to do our job. If we're just coming back after we've finished this and just present to them where we're at, I have no problem with that.
I think 90% of what you do, probably the finance committee doesn't care about, but
Exactly. And
But
this
on
is
the other
90%
hand,
of what we
there's
do.
probably 10% of it that they are going to be, that may be interested in.
I think more what they're going to be interested in is this number 6 that Stan's going to talk about in a minute, and that's our year-end appropriations that roll over. I mean, that's more of a legitimate conversation to have with the finance committee.
I think, and I don't want to say what the finance committee, because we haven't defined what their role is. So I don't want to say that Mike and Lori or whoever's on that committee are going to do this. But I think we need to be able to give them the freedom to look at what they want and need to see to understand, so they can come back to us and help us understand it more fully, as with your report. I don't know if that inhibits you. If it does, I don't want to do that. You need to do your job in a timely manner.
Yeah, and like I said, if they want to request information and we share it with them, that's fine. I have no problems with that. I mean, I'm trying to be as transparent as possible, but to take away the authority to actually do our year-end process, that's where I have a problem, and that inhibits our job.
I've never seen what happens at the end of the year, and I don't think anybody else has. So it's difficult for me or anybody else to really say, you know, what. But my feeling is that there will be certain aspects of it that might be important, and it's important in some way or fashion to get the finance committee involved. And I don't know what the right way is, but I think they need to be involved, and we need to figure out what is the mechanism whereby that is involved. Because there were a number of things in the three-quarter update on the schedule, the three-quarter year budget update, where a lot of the numbers weren't even close in terms of what had been budgeted and then spent. And I think it's important that we have the finance committee looking at some of that. But we could figure out, you know, what the right role is. And I'm not the person that can figure that out. And I don't think anybody on the council is either. But we need to have the finance committee somehow involved in, okay, this is where we ended up, and then now we need to make some changes, and this is what's going to be reported in the CAFR. And a lot of that stuff isn't even probably reported in the CAFR.
Ty, would you and Dennis have any problem if you made a presentation to the finance committee about where you are now at the end of the budget time? Come to them and tell them where you are, what you want to do, help them understand what their job is going to be more fully, and allow them to question and determine what they feel that they can do to help and understand more fully.
Yeah, that's what we anticipated in doing
Okay.
after
With
the
next-
budget process.
With this budget cycle,
Right.
this new budget
Yeah.
cycle,
Okay.
yes.
Because it would have been different had we started earlier with the finance committee, which I won't even go there. But I want to see it working. I want to see it helping us, helping the council, helping the city, helping the public to understand what your job is. Nobody can understand it. We know we can't. We can't say, we think you ought to, when we don't even know totally what you do. So you're going to have to help educate the finance committee and in turn the council. And we will work together more fully next year, so we know ahead of time what's coming and how to prepare for it more on a quicker basis, so we don't have to say, well, we could have and should have and would have, but we didn't. So I appreciate that a lot, the ability to work with that committee.
Okay. Item 6 has to do with the rollover of capital projects that haven't been encumbered, I think, is what I'm reading. maybe I'm misunderstanding what that particular sentence has, but it sounds like to me that it has to do, obviously, if something has already been encumbered, by definition, it is going to roll over. And it sounds like what's happening is capital projects that weren't contracted or weren't encumbered are still rolled over regardless of whether they're committed or not. Am I misunderstanding what that is?
Sort of. Capital projects, let me step back. Operating budgets typically are year to year. Capital projects may span 3-4 years. And so we set up a budget with a capital project. We may not have finished our RFP process where we've chosen a contractor or bid something out, but we still have those funding sources set aside for that project. Because it doesn't make sense for us to go out, do engineering, and then, oh, we're not going to give you the money to finish the project. So because it has a longer life cycle, those project budgets roll from year to year to year until they're expended or closed or canceled.
Yeah. Well, certainly once the contract is let, it's encumbered, right?
Right.
So in that case, it doesn't matter. Once it's encumbered and it's going to roll over.
Correct, but if it's not encumbered and we've already made, steps forward internally with the project,
Okay.
then we need the project funding to follow with the project.
Okay, well then it may be that what we're not seeing in the budget process is, right now, what we've seen is what's in this budget year. We're not seeing capital projects or even encumbrances, because what we were told is the encumbrances were included in the year-end estimates. There are right now no planned rollovers. Is that correct?
Well, they're all included in the year-end estimates.
Yeah, and I guess it would be nice to see, as I'm not convinced that, well, I guess you'd have to almost look at the individual items to determine, because I tend to agree, if you've got a major project and you start engineering, that you want to have monies committed, but you also don't want to forget that those things are being done when you talk about the budget. And I think what happened this year, where we had $802,000 worth of rollovers that didn't get into the budget, there was obviously somebody didn't include that in the budget when it should have been included. And that was why we have a problem. We want to make sure we don't do that in the future.
Yeah, and that's why we included it in this year's year-end numbers, because I don't believe it was included the previous budget cycle in the year-end numbers to affect the cash balance.
Well, but see, that could just be the difference in the way two people handle it, as opposed to, my feeling is it ought to be a written down policy for this is the way the city is going to handle these types of expenses, so that regardless of who's in the job or who's doing it, we know what's really happening. There ought to be written rules that avoid forgetting about $800,000 being in the budget. And
It's in my budget development booklet, so.
Yeah. Well,
What more? I guess I don't understand what exactly you're asking for.
Well, I would like to see if we're going to have that kind of thing going on, then we specifically include it in the budget as a total as opposed to a rollover. Because it looks like to me in the wastewater fund, we've got multi-million-dollar expenditures in multiple years that would be additive. And it's not clear, the person looking at the budget, that that's really what's going on. And I think it's important that the council understand what they're committing to when they agree to the budget.
Are you speaking of overtime?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because it looks like to me that there's multi-million dollars last year, and typically, if they're not encumbered, they go away. All right? But with this, they don't. And so what you're really talking about is the addition of the year before last and last year and this year, and it's not clear what's really in the budget.
Ty, is there a way to
Unless you've got
identify
that spelled out very clearly.
Not really, because in April, when we're putting this all together, we're anticipating what's going to be spent through the year. I mean, we just don't know what's actually going to be spent and what's going to roll over until we get to the end of the year.
Can you, when you true up, can you say that this was some of the expenditures that were included and anticipated in last year's but didn't happen
Yes.
until this year?
When we roll them over, we do specific adjusting journal entries, and we can get that to
Can
the
you
council.
identify that to us?
Absolutely.
Okay, I understand.
Well, and I think that should be part of what the Finance Committee
Right.
is working with, and then there ought to be a report that goes to the council and say, this is really what the budget is, and this
Yeah.
is really now what we expect to spend.
Yeah, that's what we plan on doing, running it through the finance committee and
Thank
bringing
you.
it to council.
Thank you, Ty.
Okay. And I think we don't need to cover 7 because that's really basically the Finance Committee, and we need to establish a role, and I think it needs to be written down. And I guess personally I've been disappointed in what it hasn't done this year, but that's just me.
Well, we just got started, even though we asked for a lot of time for it. We just got started last time. So to be fair to the Finance Committee, let's judge them on this year's performance. Okay? I don't want to be unfair to the public, but I also want to be fair that staff and the Finance Committee start a good working relationship together to help us
Oh, no, I think
understand.
everybody understands that.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because I'm not sure they do out there.
Okay. Now, separate from what I'd already sent out, I have asked for some wastewater fund dollar numbers that I hope you're going to be providing in the near future. I sent you an email.
I can do for period ends, so like the end of May, once we close May, I can get you those numbers.
Okay.
Other than that, it's a lot of work
Whatever
to
is the
pull it out of
latest
us.
numbers that
Okay.
you have, and you identify what the date is associated with it.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be great. And then I was curious, I've been looking on the website for the presentation materials from last Friday night, and I haven't found them yet.
That's on there, right, Gary? Okay. We'll check. It should be on the web.
Okay, I couldn't find it, and I talked with Rachel here, and she wasn't aware of it, so.
I can have Gary email it to you as well directly.
Well,
if you'd
and I
like.
think it ought to be put on the website, so everybody, I'm sure the city council wants to see the presentation as well. It's not just for me. And Jim wasn't even here that night, so I think he needs, it'd be good for his sleep time. So anyway, I'd like to see, if Rachel could just send out an email to her normal list saying, here's a link to those that, I think primarily one presentation, maybe there was more. I don't recall which.
There was economic development and,
Yeah,
Well, Public Works
Yeah.
was the big one.
yeah.
I had an overview.
Oh,
Yeah,
and that hasn't
I'll have
gone
him
out
check
yet either?
and
I do know that the Public Works presentation was dark, and they were going to be working
Right.
with the background on that.
It's done.
Okay. Well, I mean, the thing is, the sooner that can get out, the better, because that's forms the basis for the review. Okay, and that's all I had.
Thank you, Stan. Is there any other
Thank you.
public comment? Is there any other comment from council?
Madam Mayor, how long are we going to go tonight?
I would like us, I don't know the rest of you, but I would like to be able to take this home, read more fully, understand it again. I'm not ready to take any action tonight. Are you, Jim?
No.
Are you, sir?
No, I would really prefer that we had all council members
I
here.
agree.
So they could all buy into this.
No, but I got a copy if you want it.
Staff, what did you expect of tonight? Have we accomplished what you wanted? Do you have more to share with us?
Well, as far as our presentation, I think we've, that's pretty much complete. It's just what your, what your determinations are and whether you want to move forward with what's proposed or whether you want anything additional from staff.
I'm wondering if it does not have to be approved tomorrow, does it?
No, we have, what we have is we have both the further
Rollover.
discussion and the approval of the budget, but then after that, we also have the ability for you to
Go
pass a
back to the
continuing
old one.
resolution.
Yeah. I would like to be able to look at it more and make sure I understand it, because it was quite a surprise to see that amount of money and then to see maybe it's not that amount of money, and I want to look at it and make sure I understand it. And I don't want to belabor the point, but equally it's pretty important, I think, and it's that we all understand it and know where we're going. And so if you don't mind, can we come to a resolution here? Resolution, that's a term I don't want to mean. A decision that we aren't ready to approve it tomorrow? Or are you ready to approve it tomorrow?
Well, what we have on the agenda is
I
we
know we can
have
go
two
either
different
way.
items.
Right.
Right. And, I mean, it could be, the council could make that decision tonight, or the council could just, wait till tomorrow night and decide to table one and move on to the continuing resolution. I mean, that's your election.
I would like
a
to,
continuous resolution.
yeah, but do we want to give Lori the opportunity to say that too tomorrow? Now, Mike is not going to be here tomorrow, right? So if we have Lori have the opportunity to say what she wants tomorrow too?
Wait till tomorrow.
Yeah, you have to wait till tomorrow. It's not agendized for this
Right.
meeting.
But I mean, but for us to kind of come to a decision of which we want to do, we can do that tomorrow, but I want
Yeah.
Lori to be involved in it too.
Yeah.
Right, it's noticed on the agenda for discussion.
Either way.
As well as,
Right,
you know,
Okay.
potential approval or continuing.
okay. I don't have any other questions for tonight until I read it more fully.
I'm with you, Madam Mayor.
Sir?
Yeah, I feel really horrible for missing the last meeting, because the one thing I really wanted to discuss was the optimal budget.
Yeah.
But maybe, I forget, in the agenda for tomorrow, is that listed as a discussion? Are we going to have a chance
Yes,
to
it's listed
to
as
talk about
continued
that?
budget discussion
Okay.
with the option at the end of it to either pass or push forward the
Okay.
agenda or the resolution.
'Cause I don't want to rehash a conversation that I should have been here for. So I'm going to watch that. Well, I'll save my comments on that for tomorrow. But yeah, I'm in agreement with you, Madam Mayor. I don't want to pass this just yet. So
And Mr. Spear, will you guys provide us with this information here that you presented tonight?
It'll be available.
Okay.
I thank you, staff, and all the staff who's given us reports. They've been very intensive. Sometimes we didn't understand, and I thank you for explaining it over and over again to us. I would ask if when we do this again, and I guess it won't be until a little while, give us the things that you can ahead of time, so that way we can read them and understand them more fully and ask, hopefully, more intelligent questions when we get to the council meeting. It helps, just seeing it right here for the first time like we did the other day, was difficult for me to say, okay, well, what about this and what about that when I haven't even read it? So no criticism, just a request. Anything else? Any other public comment? Any other council comment? I'll entertain a motion, we adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Do we have to vote on it, or can we just adjourn? We're adjourned. Okay. What a big difference.